Recording. Okay, can you see my screen?
Yes.
Fab. Okay, guys, thank you so much for joining us this evening, afternoon, morning, wherever you are. I really appreciate you giving us your time to come along and learn about the wonderful thing, which is project and system governance. Before we start, there's a couple of things that I want to actually to cover with you. Now, one of the things that is really important that's happened this week is our co-leader, Charlie, has put herself through the hell, which is the Certified Technical Architect Review Board. And I just wondered if Charlie would be willing to give us sort of 5 minutes of her time just to tell us what that was like, how it felt, any key learnings that she would like to share with the group.
Yes, of course. Hi, everyone. If I sound funny, it's because I've got a bit of a cold or a flu or something. And I started getting sick the night before the CTA exam. So that was perfect timing to start this whole process off with. So I did my exam yesterday morning, and it was an amazing experience. I was extremely worried beforehand that I was going to be too nervous to present properly. That was one of my biggest worries, and that I was going to just bomb on the presentation and the QA. And at the end of it, that's, I think, one of the things that I did really well, that I was comfortable presenting. So just an overview, everybody, I think, understands the structure of the exam. You get there and they lock you in a room for 2 hours and you have to do the drawings and go through the scenario. I had a lovely proctor and facilitator. They went out of their way to help me. If a pen dropped, they're there to help me pick it up. They were 110% committed to make it as easy as possible for me. Then you go into the room where all your drawings are on the wall, and I had to do the presentation in 45 minutes. So I was expecting this huge big clock on the back of the wall with red numbers ticking off, and there was this tiny little clock, and I kept on forgetting to look at it. So that was something that I would want to change, is that maybe have a bigger clock, because at one stage I looked up and I only had 3 minutes left, and I still had so much I wanted to talk about. To actually go and do this exam was an incredible experience. I sat in the Salesforce lobby beforehand, and I realized for the first time what an immense privilege it is. I used to live in South Africa, and if I was still there, I would never have had this opportunity to be able to do this. So just joining this group, just working on the material, and then going to do your boards, whether we fail or pass, I think is such an achievement. It's something that we can all be proud of. It's a hectic journey. We learn a lot, but I know that now today I am 110% better architect than what I was 6 months ago, and much more than what I was a year ago. And that's what I want to be. That's the aim I had for myself. So I don't want to take too much more time. I just want to say it was an incredible experience. It wasn't half as bad as everybody said it was. It was tough, but it was a lot of fun as well. I had a great time. The judges were great. And if you worry about doing this and that you don't want to do the board exam, or that's your biggest fear, don't. It should be the least of your problems, because it's an incredible experience.
Thank you, Charlie. That's really helpful, really inspiring for those of us who are trying to do this. So thank you.
No worries.
Okay, fantastic. Let's get started then. So today's session is about project and system governance, and this is a key part of the development lifecycle and deployment exam. But actually, outside of that, it's a process that many of us come across who are customer facing. Certainly in enterprise environments where we're required to follow quite strict and stringent release management processes. So this will hopefully help you to gain some further understanding. Thank you for coming back, all the people who've been before. For those who don't know me, my name is Gemma. I am a solution architect, and this is my 10th year of working with Salesforce. I work for Blue Wolf, and I'm consistently deployed onto projects to help customers realize their return on investment. I have 16 certifications, working towards CTA. My deadline is December this year, but I've actually got a provisional date at the end of May. So I've been working quite hard with Charlie, or rather we've been supporting one another on that particular journey, which has actually been such a comfort in working towards that. One of the things I love the most is meeting new people, and this community has given me a fantastic opportunity to do that. And this group as well is a fantastic group of people who are very supportive of one another. So I just wanted to thank you for your contribution. This month was a big month for certifications. We had the Trailhead DX Developer Conference, and it was quite interesting because I couldn't go, but certainly when we got to the beginning of the conference, we had about 200 members, and now 2 weeks on, we have roughly about 400. It's absolutely mental. And I know that a lot of that is largely down to you, because you've been talking about the initiative and inviting your friends and taking part. But also we've had a lot of support from Salesforce, from Blue Wolf, from Deloitte, from various other businesses who want to support the initiative to get more women, build confidence for women who want to join the architect track. I also want to take an opportunity to thank the men who are supporting us so actively in the community as well. They sing our praises and they celebrate all of our successes. So thank you to those people. So our April champions, we have 11 of you. So there's Natalia, Susanna, Cheryl, Alba, Wrinkle, Jeanette, Misty, Nikki, Faith, Alex, and Paulina. We have some prizes that we're going to send to you, and we'll be in touch with you in the next couple of weeks or so, just while we get those prizes sort of finalised. But we will be asking you for your addresses, so be prepared to get a little something in the post from us to say congratulations to all of you.
Gemma, maybe if everybody on this list could just pop us an email or tweet us a direct message with their address, then we can start collating them.
Yeah, let's do it. Okay. Thank you, Charlie. So the agenda for today, we're going to look at a few topics. I mean, the topic of governance is extremely broad. And also the thing that we've been discussing this afternoon is that it's not effectively always this, it's not right for everybody. There are different ways that various companies manage their changes. So we have a question from Maria: how does one become a champion? So effectively what a champion is somebody who has achieved any certification from the architect pyramid within that given month. Unfortunately, we're not perfect. We do sometimes miss people. So a key measure of that is for you to make sure that you share your achievements either on Twitter or in the community group, just to make sure we pick everyone up. But effectively that is what a champion is. If you get a certification in a month, you're a champion. Hopefully that answers your question. So we're going to look at what governance actually means for a company. We're going to look at what a center of excellence can bring. We're going to look at various ways to manage releases and changes into Salesforce. We're also going to talk about broadly what design standards are and how you can implement those within your organization. And then we'll look at source control and deployment best practices, and that should take us roughly up about 45 minutes. So I'll make a start. If you have any questions at all, please feel free to post them in the chat, and I'll go through them as soon as the presentation's finished. Do take some notes if you want to. Sometimes it can help if you don't necessarily learn easily by reading. It can help to just listen and take things in. I found the integration the integration boards that Nikki's been running really helpful for my CTA prep, just because a person was saying it. But we're also very open to ideas on how we can make this more engaging. So what does governance mean? So governance is the way that you manage your Salesforce org. And this could be down to who you, right down from who has various different responsibilities in the org. So what your administrators can do, whether you delegate any administration, whether it's super users, whether you have super users within your business as well. But it also includes management of your changes and releases. The idea of governance is that you set goals within your business. You set goals for your Salesforce orgs that align with the goals of your business. So if your business priorities are improving the customer experience, and you have spent the first release delivering a minimum viable product, then your goal is over the next year to enhance that process, to improve productivity, and and what that looks like is you may be implementing several different service cloud features, just as an example. Governance also means working together to achieve those goals. So ensuring that your governing team for Salesforce is appropriately engaged with business stakeholders and sponsors to ensure that you are going to achieve those goals. Now, one of the ways that you can execute a governance process in Salesforce for an organization is to establish a center of excellence. And what a center of excellence does is it brings together the right people, the right skills, and enables the team to make the correct decisions about any changes that they want to make to the org. So when you bring together a center of excellence, you need individuals with the appropriate level of expertise and decision-making power. Those decisions need to be based on business goals and align with your IT policies as well. And this is how you can engage IT much more effectively within in your process for governing Salesforce. Typically, we see Salesforce being purchased by the business. And we have, those of us who work in consulting can probably attest to the fact that we've been into projects where the IT department is perhaps not so engaged in the implementation of Salesforce and the care and support of Salesforce, because the business has gone and bought it without them actually knowing anything about it. So this is establishing a center of excellence is an effective way to actually bring IT into the fold, because you're showing them that yes, the system might be used and run by the business, and there's no infrastructure costs and processes required to support it. But actually, what you're doing with this is, first of all, you want to play ball. You want to you want to govern your system in alignment with the IT policies, but also you can start to show them the opportunity for the IT department to innovate rather than support. So it's a fantastic way to engage different departments together. A good center of excellence, on the other hand, will listen to their users. They will actively perform surveys. They will they understand that once the system is live, that's not necessarily the end of the project. That once the system is live, there comes a roadmap of individual pieces of work. And the best way to enhance the backlog and understand what the priorities are is to review what users are saying. So that could be through activities like ride-alongs, where you're sitting with the users or a few super users and just understanding what the pain points are, watching them use the system and identifying some good opportunities for enhancement. When the user base starts to ask for enhancements, and then it's about responding to those, even if the response isn't necessarily very favorable. You can at least show your users that you are listening and that you have an interest in what they have to say, and that that their request has been added to the backlog. They don't need to know how far down, but at least you've then responded. And a really good center of excellence is actually as transparent as they can be about goals and best practices as well. So I've worked with a company that published the entire Salesforce backlog on Chatter once a month, and then took feedback from people, but also making sure that if there are certain enhancements that cannot be delivered for whatever reason, that in the response to that enhancement request, the people in the Centre of Excellence have the confidence to say, we understand what you're saying, we have decided not to implement your request this time because it doesn't align with this goal, or it aligns with a different goal, and we're looking at that in more detail in the next year or so as part of our strategy. Of course, it helps if you develop and share the roadmap as well. So if they know that there's going to be, if they know that the current process for logging a case is clunky, but it's on the roadmap and you're going to be looking at that in more detail in the future, certainly you find out with older systems, then that can help to build trust with the user base, and therefore once they trust you, you'll get more reliable feedback. Okay, so forming your centre of excellence. So I admit I ripped this straight from Trailhead, and I've even put the link there so that if you want to go and have a look at this in more detail on the after the study group, you're more than welcome to. But this is a typical centre of excellence, and of course it starts with your executive sponsors. Your executive sponsors are responsible for communicating the vision and the values that you've got of the team, and steering the backlog and the priorities in order with business in alignment with business objectives. Your program team are the ones who are accountable for executing that vision. So these are the people who, these are the business senior directors and so on, who want to ensure that everything that you're releasing again is in alignment with the directive from the executive sponsors. And within this centre of excellence, we have the release and project managers, we have the business, so key stakeholders from customer service, from sales, from knowledge, maybe perhaps a knowledge manager. And effectively you would tend to start quite small at the beginning of your implementation, and then start to increase the size of that team as you progress. We then have our development teams, and these, when I say development, it doesn't have to be a coder, it can be clickers as well, who belong to individual Scrum teams. And in an enterprise environment, you could have as many as, I think at Blue Wolf, we have one project which has 36 development Scrum teams, which is just crazy. But it becomes all the more important to implement a release management process and a governance process when you've got an implementation on that scale. There are architects, so your solution architects and your technical architects, who are there to design your, to communicate design standards and to oversee the build of the system and its development, its further development. You then have people who are responsible for driving adoption, change managers, training managers, and then you have your support team. So these are your admins on the front line who are getting the requests for reports, or the angry sales manager who's saying, why is my dashboard showing the wrong forecast information? And they are the ones who are literally helping users as they use the system. So what does your centre of excellence need in order to be successful? Well, first of all, they need a prioritised backlog. So, and that backlog can be comprised of features and enhancements, but also bugs that need to be fixed as well. So, for example, if you have an issue with a page that's taking too long to load, that would go into your backlog as a bug for the developers to pick up. If it's making the system unworkable and is causing a risk to adoption, then you might prioritise that a bit further up the list. Enhancements could be something like implementing duplicate management, it could be single sign-on, it could be communities, it could be an approval process for opportunities. It could be anything like that that you don't have right now that will enhance and enrich the way that the system is being used. And of course, before you can start working on that backlog, you need a charter. And the charter is agreed and set by the program team and sponsors, whereby you establish the business goals and strategies and the working principles that your centre of excellence will adhere to as they work through the backlog of enhancements and fixes. So a key activity of the centre of excellence will be to implement and adjust a release management process. And the way that you manage your releases really depends on a few things. It depends on the culture of your organization, it depends upon your IT policies, and it depends upon how complex and deep your implementation is as well. You could argue it depends on the size of business as well. There are some projects which are very straightforward, where it's just accounts, contacts and opportunities and reports, whereby it's for a small business or a small corporate, a corporate on the smaller end of the scale, whereby they don't have a sandbox, they don't have a full copy sandbox, or they're just on professional editions. So you have to make adjustments for those sorts of scenarios. And the release management process I'm going to take you through now really applies to more complex, multi-team, generally higher level enterprise implementations. And certainly at Blue Wolf, I know at Deloitte and certain other of the larger consulting firms, these kinds of projects tend to be more common than not, which is helpful for us because it gives you exposure in real life to this kind of process. So the types of so before we can identify the best practice processes for managing releases, we have to identify what kind of release we plan to implement. So the first one is hot fixes, or the incident release plan. And this is implemented when stuff breaks and is disrupting the way that your company is using Salesforce. So something quite urgent that needs to be fixed as soon as possible. We then have daily releases, and these can include things like a new report, a change to an existing report. It could be a new list view. It could be adding a column to a list view. It could be a very quick fix to a formula field that's not calculating correctly or is showing that lovely hashtag error exclamation mark, which means you haven't caught your zero value inputs. It could be anything like that. Minor releases are changes without a big impact. So these are things like fixing a very straightforward workflow rule, perhaps adding new criteria to a process builder, adding an extra step to a flow to look up an ID and place it into a variable that could be used later. These are things that need testing, but there are no large change management considerations for the user base. Then we have major releases, and these are significant changes to the org. So you could be introducing a new team who's not currently using Salesforce and is going to use Salesforce. You could be rolling out Chatter. You could be implementing a new business process. So you might be building a quoting tool. You might be implementing CPQ. You might be bringing financial force on board, for example, something that governs an entire business process and will have a significant impact on your users because it will change the way that they work. These kinds of releases are ones that have to be tested quite thoroughly, and they need engagement from change managers and trainers in order to ensure that the new processes are adopted. They also need very careful management and control of when they are deployed as well. You wouldn't just deploy a major release willy-nilly. It's something that needs to be planned out carefully. So how does this look for environments? So if we take the hot fixes, incident release, again, it really does depend on the business that you're looking at, but as best practice, Charlie and I were working through these earlier, and we agreed that when it comes to hot fixes and incident release management, you've got to think about what else is going on in your organization. So if you work in an organization where you have lots of different development teams, let's say 4 or 5, and they're all working on future releases, so perhaps a development team 1 is doing a particular project on that touches Sales Cloud. Let's say development team 2 is implementing communities, and development team 3 is building an entire suite of reports and dashboards to be used at executive level. That means there's changes happening all the time, whether those are clicks or whether those are coded changes. So it means that if there are any very quick fixes that are urgent and need to be made, the best practice is to actually refresh a hotfix sandbox, make the changes you need to do, and then deploy them into what's known as a systems integration system integration environment, or a SIT environment, which is effectively where you collect up everybody's work. So in a SIT environment, you would have your development teams 1, 2, and 3 all loading their, all deploying their metadata into the SIT environment, and then the hotfix sandbox would come and join the remaining items in the SIT environment. And that means that there can be a much more thorough testing process taking place, and they're testing against any hot fixes. And we call that to make sure that, first of all, the hotfix doesn't break what the development teams propose to release, so that when they release in the future, Salesforce doesn't get broken. But similarly, that the environment, the work that the developers are doing in their individual team boxes doesn't affect the hotfix. And we call that regression testing. It's an important part of any deployment where you've got multiple development teams involved. So we would deploy our hotfixes into our SIT environment, and then once we're satisfied that all the tests have passed, and you can automate those tests if you want to, you can implement some of the more effective app exchange tools or automated testing tools to help make that process much easier. But then you would deploy that, once you're satisfied everything works correctly, you would deploy that into production and it's ready for use. In terms of your daily releases, so remember this is an example, and remember this could be something like a change to a list view. That's something that you could effectively complete straight in production if it's provided you have appropriately assessed the risks and impacts of doing so. In terms of minor releases, so this is could be a change to a flow where you're collecting, you're looking up for a record ID and you want to put it into a variable for use later. This we agreed you would need to complete in a separate sandbox. So we would call this the production support sandbox. And the purpose of the production support sandbox is it's a place where you can go and try to replicate any errors. So if a user is asking for support and you want to try and replicate the error without affecting any data, then you could refresh a partial copy or a full copy sandbox and call it production support. But it also means that you could execute your minor releases in there as well. So any changes to workflow or a new dashboard, for example, then you would be able to build that in a production support sandbox, deploy it into the SIT sandbox where you can regression test against the hotfixes and the 3 development streams as well. And then once those tests have passed, you deploy those into production. And it just helps to keep those environments in sync as best you can. For major releases, then we start looking at a much more stringent and robust release strategy. Now, regardless of whether your company operates on an agile or a waterfall basis, you'll find that this method of managing your releases is quite effective because you still have a sign-off point, right? So whether your sign-off point is the end of a sprint or whether it's the end of a development phase in a waterfall project, you're still controlling where you actually complete certain activities. So in this example, we have our 3 development teams. So remember, one is doing community, one is doing a bunch of dashboards, and the other is implementing a new team, or bringing a new team on board. So they would have 3 dev sandboxes in which they're building and self-testing the functionality. When they're confident that what they've built works and is fit for purpose, they will deploy that to the SIT sandbox. And what that enables is peer QA. And what I mean by peer QA is if I want to, it's good practice for having a member of your team actually review and check through the work that you've done. First of all, to make sure it works. Second of all, to make sure that it makes sense given the design standards set by the architect, but also ensuring that it's user-friendly and gives an opportunity to raise challenges and ask questions as well about what you've built before you've opened it up for the client. Another example of how you would use the SIT sandbox is for code reviews. And there are a number of different tools out there, certainly testing tools as well, as I mentioned earlier, but the testing tools enable you to include design standards within there as well. so that you can actually check through any code that's been written to ensure that it adheres to the design standards. And then if it doesn't, then you can work with the individual developer to enhance it so that it gets to a stage where it's ready to be put in front of the customer. So at the end of the sprint, or at the end of the design, the design and build phase, that's the point where you would be released into the UAT sandbox, where your customer or your end users would be completing their testing and giving you feedback on the functionality that you've built. And of course, there's always going to be changes, right? And the temptation is to change things directly in the UAT sandbox. And that's not necessarily a good idea. Do you know why? Because if you change your functionality in UAT, then sits out of sync and out of date, and the individual dev sandboxes are out of date as well. So the devs are building code against an environment that isn't necessarily representative of what's going to go live. So it's really important to ensure that if you adopt this individual model and your development team, your end users come back with feedback that results in a change, that you do start at step one again. So you start to update your dev sandbox, change the functionality, deploy it into set, regression test it, clear QA, and then update the UAT sandbox with the changes that you have. Now, we all know that's a bit of a pain in the backside if you're doing that with change sets, right? So in the next slide, I'm going to talk through a more efficient way of completing that exercise. So the final piece, let's just say in this example, your customer's very, very happy and has approved the functionality and has said that it's ready for release. So the next step after that is to deploy your new functionality into what's known as a staging sandbox or a pre-prod sandbox. There are various different terms that people use for these environments. This is just my preferred one. But in the staging sandbox, this is your last step before you go into production. So what you're doing here is you're actually running a dress rehearsal for your deployment, so you can iron out any configuration problems that are stopping you from deploying effectively. And certainly, if you haven't got sufficient code coverage, you would be able to find out about that quite early, so that by the time you get to the point where you're going into production, you should have no errors at all at that stage. The staging sandbox is also where you would complete your data migration. So ideally, by this point, in an ideal world, all of your data is being prepared all the way through the process. And then when you get to the point where you're in the staging sandbox, then you would introduce your data, and then you would perform testing of that data and ask the client to review it and sign off the data migration, just to ensure that, first of all the fields are mapped correctly, that the cardinality is correct, that we've been able to test the functionality against the large data volumes. And of course, there may still be some changes that come out of this deployment, because data introduces a layer of complexity. So you might be going back to the beginning and then up to SIT and then up to UAT, getting customer sign off for that individual change before you push back to staging and regression test again. And this is what I mean by the time you get to production and your whole solution has been signed off and is ready to be released to users, you would tend to, everything should be, in theory, working correctly by that point. And I know that you'll all be laughing, because we've all seen many, many times situations where this doesn't happen. But that's part of the fun, right? Two other environments that I haven't put on here could be a training sandbox and a production support sandbox, as I mentioned earlier, for minor releases. So your production support would typically be full copy, and you might produce a partial copy sandbox to enable your trainers to train your end users in a safe environment, so that when they finish their training and they come in on Monday morning, they've got their email with their login details, and off they go straight into production. So your guiding principles when you design a release management process, these are the things that need to guide you as an architect. First of all, are there any other projects going on? I'm working on a project at the moment where it's sales and marketing cloud. But the beautiful thing is Marketing Cloud is completely independent of Salesforce. So from our perspective, and also it only connects to Salesforce in production. So, but they can develop in the sandbox. So from our perspective in the Sales Cloud team, all we need to make sure is that we have sufficient data that can be pushed up and synced with Marketing Cloud when we go live. So it does mean that we don't need a very robust release management process because, first of all, the functionality is very simple, just accounts and orders. It's like a dream come true. I suspect a certain exam has something to do with that. But it also means that we only need one sandbox to work in, and then we will deploy into a full copy as a staging, and then before we go into production. Obviously, if you build something in Salesforce in your sandbox, make sure you test it first before you even release it to your peers, because then it shows that you have fully considered, and it shows your team as well has fully considered the impact of their functionality that they've built. Another guiding principle: try and keep sandboxes in sync as best you can. And what that means is when you set up your environments, you'll need to think very carefully about what type of sandbox is appropriate to use. So whether you use a Dev Pro, a Dev, a partial copy, or a full. And one of the things that's incredibly important to consider there is how often you can refresh those sandboxes, and also the amount of data that each sandbox will hold. In terms of the final principle, if your architects give you a set of design standards, it's because they've been speaking with clients and they've been looking at the data, things like the data model, the sharing methodology, the sharing requirements, and they've come up with those standards based upon the bigger picture. So as an architect, it's really important to make sure that you, first of all, communicate your design standards very succinctly and very clearly to ensure that your team will adhere to them. But also, if you have coding standards that your more technical people have put into place, then you use the tools you have. You can build those into your testing, your automatic testing solutions, and you can even build them into continuous integration tools as well. So design standards, where do you need them? Well, you need them in your code, you need them in your integrations, you need them in your documentation, you need them to test, and you need them when you're dealing with large data volumes as well. So some examples of design standards would be: make sure that your team uses the description field. We know it can make it longer, to make it take more time to build things, but it's so important to make sure that you leave a good paper trail. I always say to my team, think of your admins. We're only going to be in there 5 minutes compared to the length of time that the admins are going to be working on it. It's their system. They're going to be looking after it going forward. So to me, there's nothing worse than looking at a list of workflow rules and it just says update opportunity. And I'm face palming for the rest of the day. And then I'm wringing the neck of the person who created it. Thank God for day created. But it's really, really, really important. And Charlie's just made a good point as well about adding testing into your definition of done. So those of you who work with Agile and Scrum, that's a really good way to ensure your design standards are up to date, your testing standards are up to date. Keep your data architecture consistent. So if you have multiple projects going on, the last thing you want is one architect saying, okay, I've got a bunch of orders coming, I'm going to integrate into Salesforce, and they have an order date and they have a value, and I'm going to add products to them, and I'm going to put them in opportunities. And they haven't really had the discussion with other architects to find out, whether orders are being used. So in another team, who is posting more transactions into Salesforce, you could have 2 different tables containing extremely similar data. So that's an excellent design standard, is to say, right, okay, orders are for transactions and opportunities is for value-based selling. Bulkifying code, so making sure that you're working with lists rather than individual records. is an excellent design standard because it will help to reduce the number of prevent you from hitting governor limits, and also in some situations reduce the number of API calls that you're going to be making. And if you decide to deprecate any particular features, then agree on a standard method of deprecation. So whether you take a backup, whether you label everything as being deprecated, doesn't matter which, as long as you agree it with every architect who's working on Salesforce. So how do you enforce those? Well, number one, tell people they exist for a start. You don't want people necessarily creating fields outside of design standards. I need to go and stand over them with your hands on your hips and say, why have you done this? And they go, well, I didn't even know. So communicating them is really important. So have a strategy. Make sure you explain why those design standards are important, because these are intelligent people you're working with. So give them the opportunity to understand why and enhance their learning as well. Because after all, you're there as a senior resource on the project, so you can bring them into that level of understanding with you. As I said before, you can build them into your automated testing software. And when you're QAing, so if you are part of a development team and your colleague gives you a piece of functionality to review, then take your design standards into consideration. There's absolutely nothing wrong with you putting the ticket in Jira back into QA rejected because they haven't put descriptions into their fields or into their workflows. And certainly one of the design standards I like to put in is if I'm building an automation, if I'm building a field which is part of an automation or is referenced by a formula field, then I will actually give my team a framework. So there's a list of bullet points where it says, please tell me if there's any workflow rules that this particular field. Tell me what other fields are involved. So if it's a formula field, I might say, well, the account owner field is referenced by this formula. If it's indexed, make sure people know that the field has been indexed. If it's part of a skinny table, you can put things like that into the descriptions, and that just helps to keep things much more easy to understand. And again, think of your admins. Okay, so I mentioned earlier about environments and source control and how to keep your environments in sync. Now, an example of source control, version control, is which is often used, is an open source tool called Git, and that enables you to build repositories. And in those repositories, you can store your metadata. So even if you create a process builder, what you're actually doing in the background is creating a flow definition. So you can check that flow definition into any branch of your Git repository. And that enables your release manager to actually automatically deploy that between different environments. And it means that there's the latest version of what's been checked into that repository is the truth. So typical things you get asked in the exam is about branching strategies. We get asked about it in the CTA scenarios as well. So it's a good idea to complete the trailhead on Git and GitHub because it helps you to understand how the branches help each other. So in my typical strategy, I'll have a feature branch, a hotfix branch, and then you'll have a default branch, which is effectively your master. It's where anything that's in the default branch is going to go off into production when you choose to hit the big red button. So it enables the easy deployment of the latest version of your build into each sandbox and enables you to keep them in sync, and also enables the automated testing of items within the branch. So you can actually tell your testing, there's a tool called Provar, which can actually examine your Git branches and run tests on them automatically. Okay, so some of the tools that you can use to deploy between sandboxes and production include change sets. So those of us who are clickers, we can use these for daily and minor releases if we choose to implement a sandbox strategy. We know that they are quite depressing when you first start working with them, and I find that actually if I'm deploying via change set, the easiest thing for me to do is to reach this nirvana sense of acceptance that it's not going to work the first time. So you want to keep your change sets as short as possible. So what I like to do is put all of my is identify what features I've built are dependent on other features. So I'll usually have one change set which I deploy my fields in, and another change set for page layouts, and another change set for any validation. And then I'll start thinking about more advanced things. And I tend to do it in chunks because it helps me stop throwing my laptop out of the window when it doesn't go through the first time. Also, if you use change sets, you'll get a lovely chance to meet the deployment fish. And I can't really explain what that is. It's just a random symbol that somebody decided to build, but it's famous the world over. We also have the Force.com IDE, integrated development environments, fairly becoming quite retro now, actually, but it enables major and minor releases to be deployed by, and they do tend to need development skill in order to deploy using an IDE. More recently, DX was released. So those of us who've been working in IT for sort of 20 years or so would probably welcome the return of the command line. So with this approach, you can deploy between different orgs, identify all your errors directly from the command line. And there are some people who I've met in the community who are extremely comfortable in this environment. So it's a preferred route for them. We then have tools like Jenkins, and Jenkins can facilitate continuous integration. So what that means is a drip feed of all the different changes that you've made in sandboxes, and being able to ensure that production is continuously being updated. So you feed your Git branches into the CI tool, and then you can effectively schedule releases of the latest version from the default branch. Okay, I'm going to open up for questions. Let's have a look in the chat first of all and see if anybody's asked any. Oh wow, okay. So Andy asked, if we don't have the luxury of a test team, are there any recommended guidelines or tools on how to test new functionality, regression test, and UAT? So Charlie has responded to say you should add testing into your definition of done. So if you don't have a test team, your developers and functional people should take up those tasks. You'll then have to upskill these guys to be able to do the testing. So add that to your risks and your project planning. Would anybody else like to ask a question?
So I have a question.
Go for it.
Yeah.
Are you testing me?
I think it's a question that I struggled a lot with in the early days of being an architect. So I'm an architect, I'm on a project, and I'm not an experienced architect. And now they say, okay, what is my whole deployment and lifecycle and governance structure? Where do I start? Where do I get templates? How do I know what's going to be right? I know there's a lot of details in these answers, but what is the best way? What resources can I use to make sure I set this up correctly, especially the first time?
Okay, so first of all, you heard of a company called Deloitte?
Yeah.
And if you ask those questions, I'm sure she'll be able to respond to them. I'm kidding. Admittedly, if your client has the luxury of working with consultants, then that's something the consultants should be able to respond to. But where do you start? Start with your IT policy. That's what I would say. So I would look at how they currently operate, understand what their current pain points are, and then try to work with your IT department to come up with a strategy for establishing that your center of excellence and a set of standards for release management. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, no, I think that's great. And that's something I always forget to do is we learn all these things about all these cool tools, but always start with what is there. Find out, do they have some of this in place, and how you can just enhance it without having to reinvent the wheel. That's a really good point.
Yeah. Because it might be that they actually are looking for some way of transforming the way they work too, because they've probably got themselves, or possibly got themselves into a way of working that's just there because it's there.
Yeah, absolutely.
So it's a good opportunity.
That makes sense. Thank you.
Can you help anybody else? Okay. Well, thank you so much again to everybody for giving us your time this evening. I'd really like to get some feedback from you as to whether you think the format works, any feedback around the presentation itself and the content, and we'll open up another vote at the beginning of May for the next exam. So please do make sure you come along and vote. And if also we are looking for a new way sorry, I'll start again. So some of the other things that you can do following this are to, first of all, check out the architecture trail mix that Salesforce has put together. There's some fantastic resources there. Complete the Git and GitHub basics branch. If you do get the opportunity to volunteer to work on a project that has a stringent release management process, then there's no substitute for the experience that you'll get from doing that. If you're having any problems at all, try implementing the process. Have a little go with a few Trailhead have a little go with a sandbox at your own organization if you can, and just try and replicate it and see how that might work. So please come and join our group. You may have noticed as well that we started a website recently. It even has a swag store. Woohoo! So we'd really like it if you want to get involved and push, tell people about us. Then by all means, come along, buy a T-shirt, wear it to a Salesforce event, submit a story. Tell us how Ladies Be Architects has helped you and build some confidence in becoming an architect. And of course, I'm only running this study group because no one else volunteered. So we would love it if you are up for presenting a study group and you have a specific topic that you feel that you can present strongly on, then please come to the website arcladies.com and fill out a volunteer form to run a study group. We've got one already, which is wonderful, and you can run a study group yourself. Other ways you can help, tweet us. We're very active on Twitter. Speak about your experience. If you want to come along and just not necessarily run a study group, but you'd like to talk to other members about your experience, we would love to hear about it. And finally, you can always submit a member story as well. We are posting blog posts about each member and how they have benefited from being in the group, and we would love for you to take part as well. So that's the end of this session. Thank you so much again for joining us. And we hope to speak to you soon. If any of you are going to London World Tour, please make sure you come along, and I will make sure that I'm easy to find. Thank you.
Thanks, Gemma.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Yes, thanks for a great session. I think this was really helpful.
Thank you. Bye. Thanks, everybody.